For our next session titled Securing the Next Industrial Frontier, we're pleased to welcome Kevin O'Connell, founder and CEO of Space Economy Rising, and Carissa Christensen, founder and CEO of BryceTech, for a fireside moderated by Billy Mitchell of Defense Scoop.
All right. Well, this is fantastic. I've never been on a stage like this before, so I don't know where to look, but I'll do my best to look everybody in the eye as much as I can. But like the MC stated, I'm Billy Mitchell, executive editor of Scoop News Group, and thanks so much to the SCSP team for having me here today. And I have the privilege of sitting down with Carissa Christensen, founder and CEO of BryceTech, and Kevin O'Connell, founder and CEO of Space Economy Rising, to discuss the changing role of space for U.S. national security and economic interests, and how to secure this critical frontier, which is becoming more and more of an important topic. So, Carissa, Kevin, thank you both so much for joining me. Welcome to the conference.
Thank you.
So let's get started. Before we kind of dive into the topic, let's give the audience a bit of background on where each of you is coming to this issue from. Kevin, I know you spent some time in the government, in the Office of Space Competition, and Carissa, I know we've just talked, and you spent most of your career from the opposite side in industry working on that. So maybe we'll start with you, Carissa, and get a sense of what it is you do with BryceTech and how you're approaching the national security and space issue.
My day job is as CEO of BryceTech. We're an analytics and engineering firm. We work with government agencies that rely on deep tech to execute their missions. So space, defense, chem bio, red nuke. My role, my other job is as an advisor, and I've spent my career focusing on the space ecosystem and really targeting a position of independence, objectivity, and very critically, evidence-driven analysis. I am a senior advisor to the Schriever War Game. I sit on a number of advisory boards, and over and over, I see that not presupposing the answer, but turning to the data really yields valuable strategic insights when it comes to space. So I'm very eager to have this conversation.
Fantastic. And Kevin, I realize now I call it the Office of Space Competition. It's Office of Space Commerce, where you were before now joining the industry side of things. But give us your background with Space Economy Rising and how you're coming to this issue.
Well, so I founded Space Economy Rising when I left the government at the end of the first Trump administration. But it comes at the end of 30 years of work on space commercialization in one place or another at the RAND Corporation, in my own company that I had before I went into the Commerce Department. And so today what we do is we work on helping mostly young companies work through strategy, finance, and regulatory issues specifically. Also work with investors to help them understand very specific market segments in the space economy. And then we get to travel around the world and talk a lot about what's going on in the space economy. I'm just back from 10 days in Japan. The question we get most often around the world is, Kevin, how do we grow our participation in the space economy? So delighted to be able to do that as well.
Okay, well, let's take that another step further. I'm sure we've spent a good amount of time already today discussing the landscape of where we are in sort of a space race, if you want to call it that, but the reemergence and development into space. How do you define that? Where are we today in terms of, moving to space and deeper in that direction, comparing it sort of to the 20th century where that was the hot button issue of the time? And what are some of the economic and national security dynamics at play that maybe are different than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago? Kevin, we can start.
Yeah, sure. So I think there are probably three big trends that I could highlight. There are probably more than that. The first is there's really universal interest in space because of the national security and economic benefits. I mean, we see this around the world. We see it in Africa, literally. So there's a much larger set of players than we saw historically in this space. Second is that space is today overwhelmingly commercial. Now, there's a whole variety of definitions of what constitutes commercial, from, let's say, Lockheed Martin down to 5 people sitting in a garage somewhere. But there's much more activity that is deemed commercial to the extent we can count it. And counting is hard in this area. We can turn back to that a little bit. The last thing, and I've said this for years, I've always written about space in terms of markets and things that are on the ground. We get excited about the things that are going on in space, but they do not work unless the things that happen on the ground actually work. And literally the first interview I had with the Secretary of Commerce, I didn't know it was an interview at the time, was why is the Commerce Department involved in space? And so things like regulation and talent and finance and export promotion and things like that, if they don't work, then we don't work in space. And so I would argue there's as much of an economic aspect to this. I've always said space is about economics and gotten a lot of weird looks from space audiences. But I think that's really critical. What are the sources of competitiveness? We're seeing this not only in the United States, but we're seeing it globally. And I'd put it another way. I think what we're talking about here at some level is an economic competition for space resources. And it's always frustrated me that the economic parts of the US government are not fully engaged in this. So NASA and the Department of War absolutely engaged, very pertinent. But when I got to Commerce, it was sort of the first to say, why aren't the rest of the economic agencies in the US government engaged in this fight? And I hope we'll see more of that in the future. Exim Bank, we got the Exim Bank reauthorized, other agencies like that.
Fascinating. Carissa, from your perspective, how are you looking at the evolving dynamics in this space?
In the space, we're not afraid of it. Pulling on that space is about economics thread. So we today are in a period where space activity is very different than it was a decade ago, certainly 2 decades ago. And it's not that there was no commercial activity, even beyond the Lockheed Martins. There were massive satellite operators. Every television show most of us watched for the majority of our lives at some point was transmitted via satellite, either direct to our homes or to a cable head end or to a broadcaster. Was a lucrative market, $100 billion market. It's declining because television is declining. And now we're in a world where there are new players. And specifically, those players, they were invited in by some super angel billionaires with big space ambitions and a desire to leave a space legacy. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, who really focused on launch and particularly launching humans. Their involvement, their investment in launch, catalyzed an additional wave of venture investment. And space didn't used to have venture investment at any scale. One of the things that's enabled it is different kinds of satellites. Historically, satellites were very big and very expensive. We're now seeing much smaller satellites, so a massive 18-wheeler truck versus a dishwasher, maybe a small van. Why does that matter to a venture investor? It's hard for me to build 1/10 of a $200 million satellite as a demonstrator, but I can build 5 satellites as a demonstrator. And so we've seen hundreds, around 600 companies in the last decade, startup companies in space of a type that didn't used to exist. They're not doing deep technology innovation. They're doing technology evolution and business process innovation. And so we have capabilities we've never seen before. And it's created a really interesting situation because venture investment, as this audience certainly knows, is risk tolerant. Space actors, particularly space policymakers, are not so risk tolerant. And there's a real tension. We've got companies in search of a customer. We've got risks of companies going out of business. We've got companies turning to the national security establishment as a customer. And that's created a very interesting dynamic right now.
Yeah, it is very palpable, and it is an interesting time in space. Kevin, taking that a step further, given your background in government, how should the U.S. be looking at sort of its approach to building a secure and competitive industrial base as some of those new players emerge? How should it be thinking about navigating those new dynamics? Obviously, again, you spent time in OSC. That has its own challenges, whether it's budget or changes that are going on, but how should the government be playing a role as a leader in this emerging space?
Sure, so let's acknowledge first of all that in the United States we have the largest entrepreneurial group in the world that are interested in space. We have government funding and private finance. We can focus on the relative values of those in the market. And we have the largest and most diverse space market in the world, from exploration to defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When we talk about the space economy at a macro level, we do disservice to the things that are actually going on in specific market verticals. How do you think about it from a government perspective? Number one is try to interfere as little as possible with what I just talked about. I think we have a recipe, if I can oversimplify it this way. I think we have a recipe that has worked quite well and that I'm starting to see speed up. And the recipe goes like this. The U.S. government places small investments in ideas that are potentially interesting. No guarantees, interesting ideas. An entrepreneur then goes to Wall Street and says, hey, what do you think about this? Because you look about it from a risk perspective differently. You look for differentiation in that. And that's a cycle that is starting to speed up. And so encouraging that to happen. So how does the government do that? I think signals from the government are very important. We've seen in the Secretary of Defense's speech on November 7th a serious effort to talk about acquisition reform. We have commercial strategies that different agencies of the U.S. government have. And then policy, we can come back to that in a little bit. I mean, there are ways for the government to encourage this, to encourage the use of commercialization. As you know, I led the Office of Space Commerce, and what people don't realize is that is legally the advocate for the commercial space industry inside the government. That doesn't always make sense to people. How does that work? Far from cheerleading, it's everything from publishing space data statistics to helping people with regulatory issues that they're struggling with, to a whole host of other things. And I was delighted to see Secretary Lutnick last night name a new director, Taylor Jordan, of the Office of Space Commerce, because I think that's a critical part of the story here.
That's great. And Carissa, back to you, thinking about the economic or market indicators, some of those analytics and the data you talked about earlier that are key to this, what are some of the ones that best illustrate the growth and maturity of the commercial space sector today?
So, growth, yes. Maturity, question mark.
Well said.
Because the data is really interesting. So, we have seen dramatically increased investment. Last 10 years, just that venture-aligned investment, and those billionaires, maybe $60 billion into space, close to $70 billion, which has generated other investment as well. We've seen, as I mentioned, hundreds of startups globally, with the majority absolutely in the US. We've seen increased activity. So a decade ago, we weren't breaking 100 in terms of global launches. Now we're well over 200. For most industries, going from 100 to 200 anything is not very exciting. For us, that's massive. More compellingly, there were, 10 years ago, around 1,000 active satellites on orbit. More than 10,000 today.
Wow.
That's an enormous increase. So more manufacturing activity, more launch activity, more companies. What we haven't seen proportionally is growth in revenue. And how can that be? Two reasons. One, it takes a while to develop these systems, deploy these systems, demonstrate their capabilities, and so we've been in that cycle. Two, I'm talking when you look at the industry at the macro level and you aggregate all those submarkets, one of the big drivers was television. And as I said, television's getting smaller. And it was so big that it kind of swamps the growth in other areas. So satellite broadband, we're seeing growth. Satellite remote sensing, we're seeing growth. The one caveat I'd offer even on that growth is, based on the initial investment thesis, more of that growth is coming from government customers than from non-government customers. And that's consequential on a number of levels. It certainly does reduce the opportunity to scale. It certainly does change the way those companies operate. And so the question of whether we're going to see the next $100 billion market outside of national security, I think is still an open one. And if we are, I think there's a general consensus it's going to be broadband.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the supply chain. It's incredibly important to, anything, but especially in this, evolving space dynamic. And again, back to the data and analysis that you've been able to see, Carissa, how can that help decision makers, the folks in this space industry understand and mitigate some of the risks? Because as you just mentioned, there are a lot of them. So how can that data analysis better help folks understand where the supply chain is going and what we need to do to make sure it's reliable and resilient?
So it seems so basic, but I'm going to say it because Kevin and I both could sit here, and we will not, but list companies that have built companies almost without consideration of the customer side. Even today, even with venture funding, there's a vision. It's particularly in the 5-6 years ago period, a lofty vision fueled by an aspirational goal and unsupported by very much analysis. So finding paying customers, assessing what they need and mapping to that is a non-trivial application. I think more interestingly, for government decision makers and policy makers who are thinking about incorporating these desirable capabilities that are lower cost, that are agile, more resilient, how do you incorporate a capability being offered by a company that might go out of business next year? How do you manage that risk? How do you assess that risk? And so figuring out what that looks like and predicting, not a point value of those outcomes, but predicting a range of outcomes and having strategies to manage those, I think is really fundamental to us moving to what we were talking about in the last panel was talking about, really incorporating commercial space capabilities for national security in a way beyond a pilot program, in a fundamental, reliant way.
I think though that we've come a long way in this regard. So I grew up in the satellite imagery commercialization business. Mm-hmm. And in the old days, what people would say is, I've got two companies. If they go out of business, the government is then caught with the messy task of on-orbit assets, archival data, all sorts of things. Today, if a company goes out of business, and companies will go out of business, that's resolved on a commercial basis. The broad financial community we talked about earlier, other larger companies can step in and absorb some of that capability and worry about those problems in a way that the government is not optimized for.
I do think that absolutely can happen. You can certainly smooth the path in given how you structure your contract.
Sure. Absolutely.
Right. So it's a partnership. It's a collaboration.
I want to take it to the policy side of things. We were talking about this a little in the green room, but people might feel like there's not a lot of policy out there for this, but you have a different opinion. But also how government and policy can enable private sector leadership, but also safeguard critical technologies at the same time.
So we do hear people saying there's not been a lot of policy development in the second Trump administration, and I would remind them that policy developed in the first Trump administration, because it was not remanded by the Biden administration, remains in force. And so I also remind people that the Trump 2020 national space policy, the first goal is promote and incentivize private industry, okay, just as a reference point. That said, there are other space policy directives. Many people in the room are aware of them. Cybersecurity in space, space traffic management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those remain in force. Do they need to be tweaked? Perhaps a little bit, given developments in the last few years. But beyond that now, we have a new executive order on commercial space. And what I like to tell people, I'm sounding a little bit like the old professor here, I like to say, hey, let's read the words on paper. And that's everything from other executive orders that absolutely relate to space. If you don't understand the huge consequences for space of Golden Dome, then you're not paying attention. okay? But there are other executive orders on the America First investment strategy, on the revitalization of the nuclear infrastructure, et cetera. We will not have a large, vibrant economy on the moon unless we have nuclear power and propulsion. And so there is policy that relates here that people need to pay attention to. The government can absolutely figure out ways to encourage both the government, but also better ways to do business. I mentioned signaling before, longer term contracts, things they're going to explicitly work on with the commercial sector for pick a number of years. I don't care what it is, but signal how long you're going to invest in something on a commercial basis.
Just to add to that, the policy through line is so impressive for space, right? There was a very substantial policy extant under the Obama administration. Quite a lot of that was continued under the first Trump administration, which made some bold policy moves, continued under the Biden administration. Yes. So that old space is bipartisan adage,
right?
You can still find some proof for that.
So one question I want to jump to, because this whole event is focused on AI and space, and space development is not happening in a vacuum. There's all these other quote-unquote industrial type revolutions that are ongoing. AI is the big one, but there's a number of other things that have mentioned today: energy, cybersecurity, and things like that. So you sort of teased it in your last thought, but I want to ask both of you this: as all these emerging technologies and concepts and other things that have those connective tissue to the space dynamic, how are you thinking about those? Because again, it's not happening in a vacuum. You have to account for what AI in space is going to look like and how that could change that dynamic, or what it's like to secure this from a cyber standpoint, or the need for energy. So what are those key thoughts you're having about these other domains that are now intersecting, and what should we be thinking about as AI becomes more important in our daily lives and inevitably in space? Carissa, maybe come to you.
So there has been a long-standing space challenge, which is when you've got highly capable satellites that are collecting data, whether it's on a planet, whether it's images of Earth, you're collecting so much data, and returning it to Earth and then processing it is a very large task, and you're losing opportunities to act on it in an immediate fashion. So that function, that idea that at the edge you can assess the data you're collecting, make decisions about what next action to take, and we've done this, at an initial level for some of our rovers, for example, but that you can, in a very sophisticated way, drive next step decisions. That's a wonderful example of an AI application. And you can decide what you return and what you process and what you do with that. So there are some space problems that have been pretty intractable that could become tractable. On the flip side, the development of space systems is, in its way, fairly conservative, particularly with regard to safety, particularly with regard to reliable performance, because you're sending hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to a remote location. There are safety processes and approaches and development philosophies that are going to be challenged by AI systems that don't have the traceability and predictability that are embedded in those expectations. So there's going to have to be some process change in order to fully accommodate and take advantage of AI systems, and also performance failures. There's less tolerance for performance failures than there are in some other industries, and that's just a necessity.
I think that makes total sense. Kevin, any thoughts on whether it's AI or another area that really has a pervasiveness in the way that space might evolve?
Yeah, there's a ton of technologies moving forward, and the benefit here is that in many cases there are literally trillions of dollars being invested in them. Everything from cloud computing and analytics to AI, quantum, robotics, et cetera. And while the government, let's talk about it from two perspectives. One is adoption. While the government may have individual focused projects in some of these areas, they typically do not have the breadth of experience increasingly with these new technologies, nor are they typically accustomed to incorporating them very quickly, trying something fast, seeing if it fails, seeing if it works at whatever. That's one aspect. The other dimension is on the regulatory side. There's this concept, awkwardly named concept of mission authorization that is now in the first executive order, and it's been fought for many, many years by folks in the government. We now have a world in which the things that were historically well understood by government and therefore authorized in law are not the mainstay of what entrepreneurs are bringing to the table. And the government doesn't necessarily have as deep a relationship with those technologies as they did in launch, remote sensing, and communications. So we have to be very careful on the regulatory side. What mission authorization is about is essentially giving the entrepreneur an argument in the debates over security and safety and other things like that. And so that's very important not to impede innovation inadvertently.
So as we close out here, there's a room full of folks who want to play a role in this and make things, make the U.S. a leader and make things more successful. As we look ahead, near term, long term, whatever it might be, I'll let you pick, but what are the things they should be thinking about from your own unique perspectives? What are those challenges or hard fought battles or things that are really sticky situations that people might not know about or that maybe aren't apparent or obvious to them that they should walk away today really chewing on? Carissa?
I can kick that off. We've had this period of massive investment in space startups, including many aspirational space startups. So we've got capabilities. We, the US, now have commercial capabilities that are very interesting. Very interesting from a defense and intelligence standpoint. Many of those companies are struggling financially. We have a moment in time opportunity to map our understanding of our future defense needs against those capabilities and act to preserve some of those companies. And it's a very atypical situation, but I think that in terms of an effective outcome has a disproportionate benefit for the long-term future of our national security space capabilities.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with what Carissa says. I think this is critical to our future national security to do that mapping, to understand almost in a horizon scanning like way what technologies are really coming in the market and backed by whom. I've always wanted that to be in the government.
But that somebody else paid for.
Yeah, fair enough, exactly. But I'm also optimistic because if space, remember on the last panel we were talking about push and pull parts of the business. Think about the historical model, which was that the government, let's say it's the NRO and Lockheed Martin. I created an imaging satellite, you need it, you figure out what to do with it. It was a push business, and the space community created tremendous innovations in that area. What we're seeing now, though, is many, many other industrial sectors showing up because space is more accessible, less expensive, to say, gee, that's worth $250,000 expenditure in pharma, in new materials, in robotics, in things like that. That, I think, is going to create a whole next wave of demand pull that we're going to be able to take advantage of. Key here is that we've had commercialization strategies for decades. I've seen a lot of these documents over the years. Let's really dive in and harness the power of the private sector in the competition that we're in globally.
Well, hopefully that gives everyone something to walk away with and something to work on after this, but couldn't thank you both enough. Carissa and Kevin, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.